Hey, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here with another episode of the Flex Diet Podcast. Today I've got my good buddy Jeff Rothschild on the program, and we are going to be talking about his latest study that was just published, not in fuzzy rats, but in actual training humans, about fed versus fasted cardio and training. Does protein change what fuels you're using, fats or carbohydrates? Does eating beforehand make a difference? Should you be doing it fasted? He did a really cool study, and we got him on the phone all the way over in Kiwi land in New Zealand there. So I'm super excited to get this information out to you. I've known Jeff for many years, and it's always great to chat with him. This is brought to you by the Flex Diet certification. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. You'll be able to get on the wait list for the next time that the Flex Diet cert opens up. That'll also put you on the daily newsletter with all sorts of great stuff free into your inbox. So go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIT.com, and enjoy my chat today with Jeff Rothschild. Hey, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here with the Flex Diet Podcast again, with my good buddy Jeff Rothschild, who is checking in all the way from Kiwi land. He's in New Zealand right now, so this is why we opted not to do video on this, because Skype may hate us, and I'm sure people write in about this, probably better software than Skype. But anyway, welcome to the podcast, Jeff. Thank you for being on.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. Always nice to chat with you.
Yeah, you've published some super cool research that we'll get to coming up. And I thought, well, I'll just get you on the podcast. I think God, when's the first time we met? I think it was out in California.
The first time we met was at the Ancestral AHS in
that's right,
Berkeley, in Berkeley.
Berkeley, yeah. That's right. Good memory. That was a fun one.
Gosh, I don't know what year that was, but that was a while ago.
God, is that 6 years ago now? Probably longer than that.
At least, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Good times. So for people who are not familiar, give your little spiel on your background and then how you ended up in New Zealand.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a registered dietitian. I've lived in Los Angeles for about the last 20 years until about a year and a half ago, where I came to New Zealand to do my PhD, looking at basically what we eat for exercise, like pre-exercise nutrition, how that affects our exercise session acutely, and also longer-term training adaptations. So obviously we care about what happens during the workout we're doing right now, but more importantly for most people is what happens over time. What should I eat to help me get the best adaptations from my workout over time.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit more about it, because you've worked with a whole wide variety of athletes, if I remember right, from tennis players to e-gamers to across the board.
I gave you the short version. I spent about the last 5 or 6 years before coming here working in a private practice setting in Los Angeles as a dietitian, so working individually with people, a lot of endurance athletes, triathletes and cyclists, but also, like you said, professional esports athletes, so professional gamers. Also, I've worked with a lot of tennis players. It was something I was kind of continuing to stay involved in research a bit while I was doing that, but just kind of peripherally, and obviously it was something I was interested in, so it was really felt like just kind of the appropriate next step for me to come and do a PhD, and obviously there was a lot of different places in the world that are excellent, but this program is just a really good fit for me, where we focus on applied research. So certainly there's nothing wrong with doing a lot of kind of test tube research that gives important information, and then there's kind of field research, but what really I'm focused on, and this group here is kind of like lab based but applied research, so really kind of tangible things that people can hopefully put into action.
And give a plug for the university and the exact program you're in.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for coaching me along here. Yeah, I'm at
I know this stuff, but people listening are like, what?
Right. Sorry. Yeah, I am at Auckland University of Technology. So the specific lab is called the Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand, or SPRINZ. So it's kind of an acronym or name you might see around. There's a lot of excellent research that's come out of here over the past 10 plus years, and so I'm really just thrilled to be a part of it.
I assume you've met Dr. Eric Helms, who's been on this podcast here before.
Yep, friend of the podcast. Yeah, I see him around quite a bit. He's kind of got the more strength side of the lab, and we have another group that's a little bit more endurance focused.
Awesome. What was the main reason you decided to go all the way over to New Zealand? Because you have a family, so you moved over there. You're one of those crazy people like I am that did your PhD later in life, which presents its own host of challenges.
Yeah. I think it was, I wanted the combination of a good fit. Like I said, it's something applied research, along a topic that was really of interest to me. And I wanted a good place to live. This is certainly one of those things. And those are the two big things. I wanted a place that I had certainly been following. Like this lab, I followed their research for a number of years and just see quality work coming out over and over again. And the supervisors that I work with, Dan Plews is my primary supervisor, and
nice.
Andy Kilding, they just have both done so much great research and have so much great experience. So just seemed like a really good fit. And yeah, it was far away, but I guess it's not that far. It seems far, but a long plane ride. It's not that different from going across the U.S. It just takes an extra, half a day basically.
Yeah. I did some teaching and was down in Australia last year, and that's a hell of a plane ride.
Yeah.
And I think for the listeners, it's pretty rare that programs are dedicated to applied research. They're becoming a little bit more popular now, which I think is great, but most research, even the lab that I was in, the arguments or let's say discussions I'd have with my advisor all the time was, why are you so interested in performance metrics? And I'm like, why are you not interested in performance metrics? And I asked him one day, I said, I'm so confused because you don't seem to care too much about performance, but why did you end up in the exercise physiology program? Obviously, he's very successful, been doing it for a long time. And he's like, well, I just use exercise as a variable to push stuff around to figure out physiology. I'm like, oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense because physiology at rest is pretty damn boring, and movement and stress is a lot more interesting and gives us clues as to what's going on. But yeah, it just befuddled me that even though everyone else in the lab, nobody gave two rats' ass about anything performance related, which I thought was just odd. And so I'm trying to, ad hoc these studies that are a little bit more performance based within the realms of trying to graduate and what you have for equipment and all that kind of stuff. So it's super cool to see that there's programs that are actually, dedicated to obviously the academic rigor, making sure you understand the research, but, trying to do things that are, very much in the applied realm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The other lab that I think of is where Dr. Andy Gelpin is at too. And I think it was Dr. Brown who did they both have done a lot of applied research too, which is great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So, tell us some more. I know you just had a paper that was just published a couple of weeks ago, so tell us all about it.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was less than a week ago or so. This is a study for my PhD. So, just for those that don't know, typically a PhD is well, at least in my context, is a kind of a handful of studies that all kind of look at a similar question just from a different viewpoint. So, the first part of my PhD, which we can also talk about, was we did a survey, basically wanting to figure out what people actually eat before exercise, what endurance athletes eat. So we did a survey of around 2,000 endurance athletes from all around the world and figured out, how many people do fasted training, do people eat carbs before breakfast or before exercise or protein, or why do people fast if they do it, or all these things surrounding the kind of the habits and the beliefs around what people eat before exercise. So that was certainly very interesting. And a couple of the things that really stood out is one, about 2/3 of endurance athletes perform some type of fasted training, meaning at least once or twice a week, or sometimes they do that more. And the big reasons people do that are to increase fat burning and to reduce their gut discomfort, or improve gut comfort during exercise. And also people think it's going to improve their performance or get a better workout. At the same time, what's interesting is a lot of people avoid fasted training because they think it will be harmful or won't help their workout, or they think that it might be too hungry, or they just think it's just not worth doing. And so it's certainly possible that these both can be true, but it's interesting how in many ways people feel so strongly that it's either a good thing with fasted training, for example, or it's a bad thing. And so there's really just a lot of, confusion, differing opinions, and the research, it's not as clear as, a lot of people either make out or make it out to be, or people think it is. So then that was, the kind of the first step of my PhD. Then we did this, what we consider an acute crossover study. So that was, we had a group of cyclists, we had pretty well-trained cyclists, and they did a workout on 3 occasions, once in the fasted state, once after a carbohydrate-rich breakfast, and once following a protein-rich breakfast. So just to give you a sense of what that would look like is the carb breakfast would be like a bottle of sports drink and a slice of bread and jam. And then the protein breakfast was the same number of calories, but it was essentially a scoop of whey protein and a couple of scoops of peanut butter. And so you're getting the same amount of calories, but the difference is obviously the carbohydrates. And then we had people exercise for 20 minutes at kind of a low to moderate intensity, and that allowed us to measure things like how much fat and carbohydrate they're burning, how hard if the workout felt, their heart rate, things like that. And then we had them do an interval workout, which was 6 by 3 minute intervals. And then of those 6, we had the first 3 at a certain wattage, certain intensity that would be considered kind of hard but doable. And then we had the last 3 intervals, the last 3 3-minute intervals were full on, as much watts as people could muster. And that allows us to see if there's any performance element of like how good can you perform interval training if you're in these after these different breakfasts.
And this was on a bike, correct?
Yeah, so we had cyclists, and this was all a cycling workout.
Cool.
So I guess I'll jump to the punchline. I think as far as fat burning during exercise, it's definitely been well established that if you're in the fasted state, you'll burn more fat during submaximal exercise. So meaning, you're going kind of at a continuous exercise at a medium intensity. It's no surprise that you'll burn more fat when you're fasted compared with if you've just had a carbohydrate-rich breakfast. So, of course, we saw that. But kind of a newer thing, there's been a few studies, but not nearly as many, is what happens if you have protein. So protein, a lot of your listeners might know, will cause an insulin response. So people might think, it's going to shut off fat burning. But it's not really the case when you have pre-exercise protein. It doesn't seem to be not just, other studies have found this, and we're adding to this now, that when you have protein, your fat burning during exercise is not exactly the same as if you're fasted, but pretty close. So you're still able to eat a full breakfast and burn a whole lot of fat during your workout. And we'll come back and talk about the ramifications. I guess you want me to just walk through kind of the key findings, and then we can kind of dive into
Yeah, perfect.
For people. Yeah, so we found during that submaximal exercise, protein allowed, again, not exactly as high, but almost as high fat burning as the fasted state. So that's pretty interesting. And then in terms of performance, there was no differences in how or how much watts people could put out during the interval workout. So that was surprising. A lot of people would assume that carbs would give you the best performance, but that's not the case, and I have a couple thoughts on why that is. Again, we can come back to that. Then the other things we looked at were hunger and gut comfort. Interestingly, there was no difference in hunger between those treatments either. So we asked people first, when they first came in, before they ate anything, how hungry they were. And you quantify this. You use it's called a visual analog scale. So it's like a piece of paper that's 10 centimeters long, and at one end is like no hunger, not hungry at all, and then on the other end is extremely hungry, and they draw a line where that is, and then you measure it, and that's a way to quantify the hunger. And we did that, again, when people first came in, so they were all in the fasted state, and then at the end of exercise. And everyone's hunger went down, but there was no differences between the groups. And then gut discomfort, that was pretty low throughout, although it was slightly higher when people had protein. So some people that had the protein and then exercised, their gut comfort was a little bit worse. Nothing was terrible, but there was a slight difference there. So basically, to just kind of summarize that again, you will burn the most fat when you're fasted. That's again not too controversial, but you can also have a protein shake beforehand and still burn roughly the same amount of fat. Your performance doesn't, for performance, it doesn't really matter what you have beforehand. And a big key for the context, though, is this workout was about an hour in duration. So it was 20 minutes of submaximal cycling and then 6 by 3 minutes intervals. So it's kind of like a typical 1 hour workout that someone might do on a weekday before work or something like that. Definitely this would be a different story if we're talking about a 3 hour workout or something like that. But again, for this context of kind of someone's typical weekday workout, that might be around an hour or so. It doesn't really matter from a performance standpoint. And again, hunger standpoint, hunger is going to go down probably because of the lactate you created during the exercise, during the high intensity intervals. And so, yeah, that's kind of the overview. Any thoughts you want to jump in?
Yeah. On the lactate dropping hunger, how long after did you measure hunger? Because what I've seen with some clients is after high intensity interval training, if you go immediately after, I find pretty much no one's really hungry. They're just kind of like, that was horrible. And in the labs, we used to just, punish people with Wingate testing, and we'd have the TAs, which I was one of them, we'd have a little unofficial, we'll say betting pool, but unofficial, of how many people would puke afterwards. And it's usually a couple, especially the Friday at 8 a.m. from some of the fraternity guys who maybe enjoyed a little bit too much the night before. But what I've seen in clients is that if you go a couple hours after and that kind of subsides, some clients I have are just like, I'm not really that hungry at all. And some clients are just like really hungry compared to, again, it's anecdotal, but steady state. Yeah, I don't seem to see that kind of bipolar effect. Have you seen something similar?
Yeah, I mean that sounds about what I might expect. I think certainly so lactate, the stuff you create during those kind of hard efforts, that will lower appetite. So that's probably why we ask people right after exercise. And so I don't doubt that if we had asked, like, if we didn't let people eat for another 2 hours, there would be, probably a difference there. But again, thinking about the practical application, you're going to do your workout, and then so no one's hungry at the end of it. And then, you might clean up, and then you probably, they would have gotten hungry and eaten. And so, the key from my perspective was during the workout and at the end of the workout, hunger wasn't an issue, even when people were fasted. So even if someone was hungry before, that's going to go away during that workout. And then if you get hungry afterwards, then that's good, and you can eat something. So just to kind of, again, from that, to almost a bit of pushback for people that say, I don't want to do fasted training because I get too hungry. Now, you're right. If it's low intensity work exercise, there might be a difference. And also to your point about people not being hungry for a while after that, I think that's probably to do with someone's gut health, how much exercise induced, like, gut permeability occurs. If someone with a really good gut, let's say a strong barrier, probably would get hungry quicker, but that kind of, like that exercise induced gut permeability probably lingers a bit longer in people with poor gut health.
Yeah, and this also kind of matches because people ask questions all the time, and it's a good question of, should I consume anything during training? And you can obviously look up, there's different recommendations from different groups, and there's a fair amount of research on this. And to me, this seems to match, kind of what I've seen and what I've just kind of recommended, that, if you're doing like 60 minutes of exercise, and again, this is a broad brush, I don't get too worried about if you're consuming anything during or anything special, unless you're really trying to maximize, performance. If I have people that I'm really trying to get more calories in them, or their stress is higher, I find that it can help to have some carbohydrates. But if it's just the general population, I think 60 minutes or less, you're probably fine without necessarily having anything special in terms of fueling. And this would kind of support that also.
Yeah, and I'll add in the electrolytes question comes up a lot.
That was my next question.
Yeah, I mean, my response almost always is if the workout is short enough that you don't need carbohydrates, so let's say about 90 minutes is probably a good cutoff, where below that you're not going to need any calories in your drink, then you certainly aren't going to need any electrolytes either. And if it's long enough that where you probably start to need calories, then you're going to, the electrolytes are going to come with those carbohydrates anyway. So I just can't really see any need for something like a noon tablet. If you like the taste, I mean, I don't think it's harmful, but for someone to think, they're doing a soul cycle or something, or even an interval workout or whatever, I just can't see why you would need that. But you hit on something that I think is a really one of the biggest and most important points of this paper. A lot of people that are burning a lot of calories. Let's say someone who's very fit, they're going to burn more calories per hour. Someone who's doing a high training volume, if they do fasted training, they're already. I mean, you already wake up essentially in a calorie hole from overnight.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't eaten for 8 to 12 hours or whatever. You burn another 1,000 calories during exercise. That's a really big hole you've dug in. And then most people don't eat enough post workout. When they're going to go to work, they might have something, and then they might have kind of a medium lunch. Then it kind of all gets made up for after dinner, or dinner and the afternoon and dinner and so on. Having, or I should say, knowing that you can have some protein and peanut butter and some calories before your workout, not sacrifice any of the kind of quote unquote benefits in terms of fat burning during your workout. I think that's really important for people, again, with a high training volume, burning a lot of calories, or who need those extra calories, but maybe don't want the carbohydrates. I don't think carbohydrates before are a problem either, but if someone doesn't want them, this protein option gives you it is really an underutilized option to avoid getting in such a big calorie deficit.
Yeah, and especially people trying to get more protein in. I've just noticed that, and I'm a fan of intermittent fasting depending on how it's done, but I'm not as big a fan of longer fasting windows every day. For some people, if they're really trying to lose weight and they're not, I would say, higher level fitness, I think it's probably fine. I've had a few higher level fitness people do like a 16-8 and they've been okay. But in general, I agree with you that if you have this long fasted window, you're probably going to be quite short on calories. And again, if that's your plan and you're trying to do body comp, it might be okay. But as you said, I get worried because I always monitor what is their evening meal. And if they start going like crazy in the evening, I'm like, well, let's just go to a more moderate approach and not try to cram everything into a 6-hour eating window and you feel like you eat everything for 3 hours before bed.
That's right. And I think another one of the most underappreciated kind of concepts is this within day energy balance. Yeah. And, and for people that aren't familiar, it's kind of, if you imagine like a zero is like exactly you're matching the calories in per calories out every minute of the day. And when you haven't eaten and you're doing exercising, you're kind of really going into a big deficit. And then if you obviously eat a big meal, you're going into a surplus. So the difference between kind of, let's say your net zero, I guess another way to think of it is the number of hours you're greater than a 300 calorie or so deficit is not a good thing. The higher those hours, it's not a good thing. So I don't know if I've explained that very clearly, but basically you don't want to dig such a big hole at any one time or for a long period of time throughout the day. So if you've exercised and burned 1,000 calories or even 500 calories in your morning workout, and then you don't eat for another 4 or 5 hours, you've dug a really big hole, and your lunch probably won't dig that out. And so you're kind of just spending a lot of the day in a large deficit, and then conversely, you're going to be in a large surplus in the evening, neither of which are a good thing from a hormone standpoint.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And do you think the interval training was similar just because that's primarily relying on stored muscle glycogen? Yeah. Eating before a meal wouldn't have really affected your muscle glycogen. Well, actually, it depends how long, but most people aren't going to eat like 3 hours before a morning workout. So let's just ignore that. So most people might eat 20 or 30 minutes or even an hour at most before a morning workout. That's not really going to end up in your muscles. So yeah, you're going to burn the same amount of glycogen, more or less in the fed or fasted state. So that's and you generally have enough in your muscles to get you through that workout. If you think about, the 6 by 3 minute intervals, that's really only 18 minutes of work. And so, yeah, you're essentially just using your muscle glycogen. That's why I said if the workout goes longer than around 90 minutes, that's when you'll see some real differences in terms of kind of feeding before and during. Yeah, and if people have ever looked or done glycogen depletion workouts in the lab, you can probably only drive glycogen to maybe 40-ish%, but man, to even do that, it's freaking abysmal. It's just not any fun. Yeah. Cool. And if we get more nitpicky on the fat, it's cool that I've seen this in a couple other studies. I know my buddy Dr. Lonnie Lowry did this with a metabolic card, just an N of 1. I've done it with my metabolic card at home too. That protein doesn't seem to change the RER all that much, right. Which is interesting. But if someone is arguing and saying, well, if you had dietary fat that you consumed with it, would you be, quote, burning the fat that you consumed or burning the fat from your body fat? If someone is using this purely as, we'll say, a hypothetical way to change body composition.
Well, probably a mix of both. If you got to think about it, the time it's going to take to go through your system. I mean, we did have some peanut butter, so 2 scoops of peanut butter. I mean, the total calories of the full meal would have been about, I guess, around 280 calories. So of that, in this context of protein, mostly protein with a little bit of fat, that would have been, I don't know, let's just say 100 calories of peanut butter or so. So yeah, I mean, you're going to burn a little bit of that, and then a little bit of the fat. But actually, this is I think it's almost the wrong question to ask, because most people think when you're burning fat during exercise, it's like it's coming off your waist or something like that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we especially the first hour or so of exercise, or a little bit more, we're burning the intramuscular triglycerides. So these are fats that are inside our muscles already. So I think it's kind of a moot point. I mean, I know you're asking it just because people would be wondering,
Yeah.
but I'm not like criticizing your question, but like that the fat that you're burning is really from inside your muscles largely, and then eventually you will burn that fat from your adipose tissue. But that's why I think people are interested in this, and it's important to study. We want to know what we're burning, but to think it's like, again, coming right off your waistline and into your muscles is it's a misnomer, I guess.
Yeah, because I think you might even know this, so I'll ask, like, it seems like in the past, like, the use of intramuscular triglycerides was just like this big mystery no one really thought of, and then there's some pretty elegant theories that if you look at just a pure efficiency standpoint, I mean, hey, look, there's a fat droplet right next to the muscle. Oh, look,
Yeah.
There's carbohydrates right next to the muscle. Maybe if a body is designed efficiently, those are the things we should use first. And I think it gets harder even looking at metabolic cart, right? So we're going to get data on fat versus carbohydrate from the whole system. That doesn't necessarily tell us where it came from. That just says, okay, here's the amount that was actually used. And do you know what the exact percentage is of intramuscular triglyceride now versus just, we'll say, to keep it simple, general fat that's released into the bloodstream via lipolysis from other areas in the body?
Yeah, I could probably find it fairly quickly, but off the top of my head, no. But I know it does change. So earlier on in exercise, it's mostly the intramuscular triglycerides, and then later, again, it kind of shifts. Also, it's a little bit intensity dependent.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that there's one clean answer. Adding some complexity is there's that those things can be stored. There's different ways to kind of measure those intramuscular triglycerides, and so there's it's subcellular, like within the cell. There's what is it like? There's 2 different areas of the intramuscular triglyceride, the lipid droplets. So even though there's some I guess say discrepancies or kind of question depending on how you analyze it, the type of kind of staining and things, you can get kind of different information. So all that is to say, it's pretty complex and not super well understood by even the people researching it, and certainly not by me. But the big picture is, it's going to come from there first.
Got it.
And actually just started to add to complexity. There's differences in type 1 versus type 2 fibers. So we have our fast twitch and our slow twitch fibers. And so the words I was looking for was central and peripheral. So there's like lipid droplets, the number of them in the central and peripheral regions of both the type 1 and type 2 fibers. So like, and it's complex, and that's the best I can tell you right now.
Yeah, and I think the only way you can get at it is even some tracers or MRS
Exactly.
or something like that, and
Yeah.
and even those techniques, which I'm not an expert in at all, are super interesting, but they all have their own limits too. So it's not like that's gonna give you the perfect picture, and then you toss in different types of athletes and what they had before and their aerobic fitness level, and we know that how well some people just use fat in general. Some people are pretty good at it. Some people are pretty horrible at it. So a lot of variability.
Yeah, and actually that's a good segue to one other, I think, one of the most interesting findings from this last study. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but there's a figure, and I guess do you have a show notes page or anything like this?
We'll add it to it for sure.
Yeah. So there's a figure 3, and what it shows is the individual data points. So basically, across each intensity, so we would expect the ratio of carb and fat burning to steer towards carbs as we increase the intensity. I'm sure most of your listeners know that. But the difference in the diet, or I should say the treatments, the carbohydrate breakfast or fasted or protein, there's differences between them, which get smaller as the intensity increases. But the difference between people is way bigger than the difference between diets. So what that means is someone who's a good, let's say a high fat burner, when they had carbohydrate treatment, they still burned way more fat than someone else who was in the fasted state. So all that is to say that the inter-individual variation, so the difference between people in terms of fat and carbohydrate burning, is way bigger than if someone decides to have carbohydrate or fast before an exercise.
Yeah, that's super cool, because that sort of fits. And again, it's not just my theory, but if someone is very metabolically flexible and they're doing lower intensity work, and they've trained that system to be good at using fat, my thoughts are, and this kind of sort of supports it, that a lot of other stuff isn't going to, let's say, matter as much compared to someone else who just isn't really good at using fat during lower intensity work. I think that in the population, people want to fixate on the thing right before they did training, right? So, bro, I'm only doing fasted training, so I'm really burning a lot more fat. Or, oops, I had a bagel. Oh, I'm doing low intensity work. Oh, it's all ruined now. But they tend to miss the bigger picture of, what is your VO2 max? What is your aerobic base? Like how well are you at using fat at a lower intensity, which I think is trainable, which I would ask you that question. But I think they miss out on the big picture, and they get like hyper focused on these small things that, the study would also agree that don't matter as much as what we think.
Yeah, there's a lot we could talk about in there. And I think there's a really cool study that just came out. The first author is Mark Fell, and I could share this with you. But the title of it, for those keeping track, is called "Carbohydrate Improves Exercise Capacity but Does Not Affect Subcellular Lipid Droplet Morphology, AMPK and P53 Signaling in Human Skeletal Muscle." So that's actually, they looked
nice.
at, it's a fancy long title, but that's where they looked at actually these differences in intramuscular triglycerides. But the thing the reason I brought it up, what they basically carb loaded people. They just gave them, again, from a practical perspective, they tried to emulate what a pro cyclist or a high level cyclist might do. They blasted them with carbs. I think it was 12 grams per kilogram the day before.
Nice.
So extremely carb loaded. And then they had them ride for 3 hours, but one group was getting no carbs during. Oh, and they also had a big ass carb breakfast, maybe 140 grams of carbs or something like that. And then they got either 0 or 45 grams of carbs per hour or 90 grams of carb per hour. So imagine fully carb loaded, a big carb breakfast and 90 grams of carbs per hour. Many people might think, oh, they're not going to burn any fat during exercise, right? So I guess it's a reasonable thing. Actually, they burned a ton of fat, but it took a little longer. At first, they're burning more carbs, but they're still they rode for 3 hours. That second hour, or the second and third hour, especially the third hour, even at 90 grams an hour of ingestion, they were still burning, mostly fat, or a ton of fat. Their fat oxidation rates were up around, 0.8 grams per, where is it? Yeah, around 0.8 or so grams per minute, which is really high.
And what intensity exercise?
It was moderate.
Moderate, okay.
I forgot the percent, but like, kind of something you could hold for 3 hours, but they're still working. So all that is to say, the duration of exercise is an underappreciated thing too. So like you said, everyone's so worked up about fasted, let's say. If you don't exercise very long, it doesn't really matter. If you exercise long enough, it doesn't really matter from the other point of view. Like, you're going to burn a ton of fat as exercise goes on. that again was an extreme case of, like I said, massive carb load and as much carb per hour as basically people could stomach, literally. And they were still burning a ton of fat as the exercise went on. And so
Super cool.
Again, the duration of exercise is super, super critical, as well as the intensity. So if you are doing just interval training and you're fasted, if you're doing a short workout and you're fasted, if you're doing interval training, you're still going to be burning a ton of carbohydrate because of the intensity angle. And if you're doing a long workout, yeah, you'll be burning more fat, but if you could still eat a ton of carbs, and at a time, it's just going to take a little bit longer. You know, there'll be a little bit less than if you were fasted, but at a point, you're still going to be burning a ton of fat. Does that make sense? I know I feel like it's jumping around a lot of things, but hopefully that's all that makes sense to people.
So if someone is listening and they want to increase their body's ability to burn fat, what would you recommend? They want to be a, quote, better fat burner, which I know that term's been overused.
A lot of people assume that I'm going to do fasted training and I'll be a better fat burner. Reasonable assumption. I don't think that's the case. My next study, the study I'm just starting, and it's going to be going on for a while, but as part of my PhD, is to look at those same 3 breakfast options, so the same thing I just described for this study, but before low-intensity training. So basically a 3-week training program of 4 low-intensity sessions per week, and then 2 interval training sessions a week. So the 4 low-intensity sessions per week will be performed, like I said, with one of those same 3 breakfasts, so either fasted or with the carb breakfast or the protein breakfast. And then the 2 interval training sessions will be fed, and everyone will have the same breakfast, just kind of like a mixed small snack, like a bar type of thing. And so we'll see if fat oxidation changes. But the key thing, the really important thing, is if we look at studies, if you're testing someone in the fasted state, yeah, you might see an increased fat oxidation from people that have done fasted training. But if you test them in the fed state, meaning you give them any kind of just standard breakfast, there's usually not a difference. Okay, and that's a really important thing. So that means, yes, in the fasted state, you might get a little bit better at burning fat. And so from a practical perspective, it might be easier for you to do fasted training sessions over time. But if you're like thinking about applying this to any kind of, let's say, a race, or even if it's like just a recreational 10K or something, to think that if you've eaten breakfast and then you're still going to be a better fat burner, that just doesn't seem to be the case. Again, there's actually not a lot of great research in there. That's why I mentioned earlier, there's people assume there's a ton of research in this area. There's really not, especially in trained people. So I'm really excited about this study. Again, just getting up and running, and it's tough to get participants. It's a big commitment for people, but that's what we'll be testing. So to your question, how do I burn more fat? Well, the first question I think is why, and I know you're kind of just throwing it out there because people want to know. And if you're competing in, I think, Ironman distance and beyond, those kind of ultra distance events, I think there's a real reason there's maybe a reason to consider that. Most people aren't doing that. I think just simply training is going to be the best way to be a better fat burner. If you look at trained versus untrained people, trained people burn more fat, however you want to quantify that, as far as their maximal rate of fat oxidation at a given workload. However, the training response, just the kind of classic response to endurance training, is you rely more on fat compared to carbs at a given workload. So you start at, and let's say you're exercising at 150 watts on the bike, and normally to start with you might be burning 75% carbs and 25% fat. Well, over time that ratio will switch. That's what's going to happen just by training itself. Now, to think, I'm going to be better at burning fat by doing fasted training, again, like I said, maybe only during those sessions when you're fasted, you might be a little bit higher. If you're low glycogen, you'll definitely be higher. But as soon as you're fed and have a, let's say, normal glycogen level, those differences will almost certainly get washed away.
Yeah, you
could go on a low-carb diet. You could lowering your glycogen level or going on a lower-carb diet are ways to be a better fat burner. But again, what's the end? Do you want to be a better fat burner for the sake of burning fat, or because you think it's going to help your body composition, or from a health standpoint? You can also look at healthier people. Generally, are better, more metabolically flexible. But that doesn't mean you need to do fasted training. That means you need to do training. Like say, trained versus untrained people are going to be more metabolically flexible, have better fat oxidation capacity, things like that. So if you're looking at a health perspective, simply doing the exercise training, endurance type of training generally, is going to improve that. Does that all make sense?
Yeah. No, that reminds me of the
Do you
study.
disagree, or does that go? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no. I mean, I generally agree. It reminds me of the study George Brooks's lab did. I can't remember if he was the primary author, who the primary author was, a couple of years ago, where they compared crossover points and looked at metabolic response using lactate in place of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But the cool part was they compared pretty high level athletes. I can't remember their VO2 max, but it was pretty decent, to, I think it was type 2 diabetes patients, I think. And the trained people, in every sense of the word, just blew the other group out of the water, in terms of the amount of fat burned, the percentages. And the thing that I think exactly what you were saying that people miss is just the wattages, just the sheer workload they could do because they're trained is that much higher. So even if you were
Right. Exactly.
not burning, let's say 10% less fat, you were up at, kicking it at, 450 watts. The other group was like barely breaking 200,
Yeah, and I think that, again, from the practical perspective, what that translates to is the number of calories you're burning per minute also. So you could look at, grams of fat per minute or calories per minute. Someone who's, if you have a higher VO2 max, you're going to be able to burn more calories per minute. And so that's going to kind of also translate to more fat being burned. You could be burning 100% fat, but if you're going out 100 watts, you're barely burning anything because it just doesn't, there's not a strong metabolic demand for calories. Whereas if you're at 400 watts, you're burning a ton of calories. And so, thinking about getting, you want to have a metabolic flexibility, you want to be able to both carbs and fat. And again, the best way to do that is to raise your VO2 max and raise your threshold, so you're able to just burn more, make more energy.
Yeah, I explain it to clients as maybe your 1 rep max, if we use a very overly simplistic version of metabolism of aerobic versus anaerobic, which that's another 4-hour discussion, and it's probably not completely accurate. But if we use that as a simple explanation now for on the lifting side of the equation, the size of your engine is, around a 1 RM. And then on the aerobic size, the size of your engine is your VO2 max, like how much oxygen can you run through the system. And if it's, bottom 20% of the population, which I've actually tested some people who have been there, even just getting them to 50% of it, just a population, like every single one of them across the board felt better, their body comp got better, their health improved, everything got better. I think it gets a little bit dicier when you're, trying to get to 75 to 90th percentile. Maybe warranted, maybe not, depends on the sport, depends on what you're trying to do. But I've just noticed the last about 3 years I've been doing this now, that I want to smack my head against the wall and go, well, why did I never check this before? It's like, oh, I never checked it before because I assumed it was good. And when I started testing it in some people, it was, really bad. And in other people, you test it and you're like, okay, that's acceptable. We're not going to worry too much about it. It's not going to be a massive rate limiter, and we'll just kind of go on our way.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's funny that, I'm a registered dietitian. I'm, obviously I spent a lot of time thinking about nutrition. I'm doing my PhD and how pre-exercise nutrition affects things. But the more I learn, the less I think, sometimes nutrition matters. I will say, so I'm sure there's people asking then, well, is there a benefit to fasted training? And I think there might be. It's just that it's not in terms of making you a better fat burner, long term. And I think the benefit, there could be some benefit to kind of that flux through the muscle. So if we think about, even if it is coming from muscle glycogen and your muscular triglycerides, that's probably good to kind of, shuttle those through. Although that said, it doesn't change too much from the fed state. So there's some reason to think that intramuscular triglyceride use might be reduced in the fed state. There's also reason to think that it's not. So again, that's where we come back to some contrasting methodologies, and so it's a little bit unclear. But if there's some benefit to, maybe just shuttling through some more, substrate that you have on board to start with, that's probably, and then depleting your tank, and then having breakfast, let's say, your glucose control might be a bit better. Well, depends if for diabetics, it might be a bit different actually. But there might be some reason to kind of emptying the tank, so to speak, and then eating from a insulin standpoint or insulin sensitivity standpoint and things like that. So I'm not saying that there's no reason. I'm not saying people should definitely avoid it. I think the people who should avoid it are the people doing a high volume of training, and in that case, they're already going to get all those benefits. But if someone's training, exercising more like 3 to 4 hours a week or 4 hours a week, there might be some benefit. There might be some reason to do that. I don't think it's something you have to do, but if you want, I don't think it's like a bad thing. So I want that to be a little bit clear too.
Yeah, I mean, that's my bias, and I'll get to that. And the part you brought up about just clearing out some of the substrates, the something I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about, and I think I don't have a lot of data to prove this, but doing glycogen depletion work once in a while and not replacing glycogen, I think it may have some benefits. So in the Flex Diet Surge, shameless plug, I just call that a distress training, right? Where you're purposely mismatching macronutrients, you're prioritizing, molecular adaptations at the cost of performance. And I think there's I'll find the study if you need it, but they did glycogen depletion work, and I think they may have only given protein overnight, and they came back to the lab the next day.
Yeah.
And I believe AMPK was upregulated for 5 days in a row, I think. So just all these people doing all this crazy stuff of fasting because of autophagy and AMPK, and I think we've kind of forgotten that, if you're doing glycogen depletion work and then you're not repleting it right away, that's a pretty big molecular signal, or at least it appears to be. And similar to what you were saying, I'm still a fan of doing fasted work if it's low intensity. I do think that, there may be some hedging of your bets of just flowing more fat through the system, plus insulin at some level, although it's confusing because it's not a linear response. If you whack insulin super high, it's going to push you to use more carbohydrates. The hard part is everybody's different. It's not a linear response. So I'm still a fan of people doing fasted, training because it's easier, less hassle, all that other kind of stuff. But,
yeah,
the longer I've been looking at the data, and like you said, there's not a lot of it, I think that how robust you are as a physiologic organism matters more than all of that, right? I remember the first training logs I got from a couple elite track athletes who were top runners in college at least. So maybe not Olympic level, but pretty high level. And I thought the coach was just dicking with me. I'm like, there's no way. I'm like, there was fast food, and I'm like, it was just a bad week. So I'm like, okay, go record everything for a week, same thing again. And I'm looking, I'm like, it's a track athlete, so everything they do is timed. So you can look up their times and see how they rank. It's very easy to quantify their, performance. You're not just saying, oh, the coach says this is the greatest athlete ever. And I'm like, I'm like, well, maybe if you're kind of a genetic freak and you're super metabolically flexible and you're getting enough calories, maybe you can survive, for a while. Not saying I would recommend that to everyone. And then,
yeah, but our body's amazingly flexible.
Yeah. And of course, everybody wants to know, did they get so much better when you did nutrition with them? And actually, they ended up firing me because they didn't want to change their nutrition. They're like, we're already running this fast. We don't care, was basically their attitude. I'm like, okay, I don't know. Yeah. Cool. So do you think that there may be some benefit to fasted training in terms of metabolic benefits in the future in terms of adaptations, or do you think that it's hard to say and is probably more minor?
Personally, I think it's more about the acute benefits. And in terms of adaptations, adaptations is if we're thinking of getting faster,
right.
Let's say endurance training related adaptations, I don't think there's much there.
Yeah,
I do think,
agree.
Again, there might be more from a health standpoint, and just like you said, flushing, getting stuff flowing through the system, I guess, a little bit differently. I think it's almost like there's reasons that you could argue that there's potential reasons that it could be benefit long term, like having more free fatty acids signaling. There's reason to think, oh, that could add some signaling that related to training adaptations. But I just feel like when people are trying to make those points, it's very like, here's a reason it could be beneficial, but the studies so far don't really show it that much. But like I said, I think there's a benefit if someone's on a hypercaloric diet, especially like a hypercaloric high-fat diet, as say a traditional Western diet and overeating. There's probably some metabolic benefit. So yeah, I think there's a reason to do it. It's just not the reason most people think it is.
Yeah, I always tell clients, it's like, okay, you're doing all this shit to like fine tune your 3-cylinder Yugo engine. You just need a bigger engine.
Yeah, that's it.
And like we'll do some of that, and I think it might be beneficial, but at the same point, we're going to measure your VO2 max. We're going to try to increase that. We're going to look at a bunch of other stuff too. So it's, more of the big picture.
Exactly.
Do you think how well people use fatty acids in general is a good marker for metabolic health?
Probably. It's not something I've looked too closely at, but I would think I'll venture a guess that trained endurance athletes do better in that department than untrained people, and so that probably comes from increasing their mitochondria and just being able to have the machinery to process that easily.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of my bias too. I mean it gets messy again because aerobically you can use both fats and carbohydrates, but my bias is fats are going to be a little bit cleaner at lower intensity work. There's some, I would say, it's not the best data that kind of hints that your level of being able to just run fats through the system is probably a marker for health. We know that like in type 2 diabetics, which is kind of not appreciated, is everybody thinks of it as kind of a carbohydrate disease, which, you definitely start having issues in the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. But as the disease progresses, you definitely end up with, issues using fats for fuels too. So you get kind of scrunched from both ends. You can't, kind of down-regulate all the way to run a massive amount of fat through the system. You can't upregulate to run a bunch of carbohydrates through the system. You're not able to switch back and forth. You're just kind of like stuck in the middle, and that causes all sorts of metabolic consequences then too.
Yeah, so that's just, you're just describing obviously mitochondrial dysfunction. So the things that are making the energy is not working well. And what does endurance training do? Is it not only builds more, but it kind of remodels, breaks down autophagy.
Yep. Say the last part again. You cut out there. You said breaks down.
Mitophagy. So that's mitophagy is a part of it. So we think of mitochondrial biogenesis and making more mitochondria, but there's also mitophagy is a key critical part of that, which means you're breaking down some and then rebuilding them. Yes. And so again, training is the kind of the key, and then the endurance training, like I said before, the hallmark of endurance training is at a given intensity, and whether that's even just walking around, you're going to rely more on fat than carbohydrates. So making better and more and better mitochondria is what training does, and so that's why it's the amazing thing that'll you can't really put in a pill.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to me how, I guess you could say formally we've been looking at exercise physiology for 100 years if you count A.V. Hill, but obviously people have looked at it well before that, and we're still just figuring out benefits of exercise now. It's like, yeah. I think there was something recently that muscles primarily release BDNF, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which then goes to neurons in your head to help increase neuronal health and things, neurogenesis, things like that, possibly. That it's just fascinating to me how muscle and even neurons are communicating back and forth, and we're still, when they discover irisin was 9 years ago now, like these compounds that muscle is secreting, and we're still finding new ones, which just blows my mind.
Amazing. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing all the new data there. I really appreciate it. Do you work with any clients or anything now, or are you just full-time on the PhD to get it done?
No, I still do work with some people. I certainly visit. My website is eatsleep.fit. People can see, I do see a few people just via Zoom, just to, keep, because that's an enjoyable part of what I do as well.
Awesome. And people can contact you through the website then, is that correct?
Yep. That would be great. Yeah.
And most of any written articles are on the website then too, or social media areas?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Facebook, Twitter, kind of the usual. You can probably find me pretty easily.
Just look up Jeff Rothschild, I assume.
Yeah, that would be. I think my Twitter, I guess, if for someone who's curious, I'm sure no one's like waiting to write this down, but my Twitter is at Eat Sleep Fit Jeff. So you can find all the stuff through there.
Awesome. I think it's been 2.5 years since I've been on Twitter, but
I like it. I've probably only been on there for about 2 years, but
oh really?
I actually think it's pretty interesting and useful. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for all your time and sharing everything today. I really appreciate it, and it's always awesome to have the primary authors of the study, come on and we get to ask, questions about too, because I think, as you know, designing a study, by virtue of doing one thing, a lot of times you can't do something else, right? So yeah. I've just learned a vast majority of time, if you email the author and you're like, hey, why did you do this instead of that? There may be something related to physiology, like we talked about. It may be related to psychology. It may be related to, equipment in the lab and people they got to even be tested. There's all these other things that go into it, because at the end of the day, you can design this quote unquote perfect study, but if you can't get people enrolled, you can't get any data and it never gets published. So you're always kind of walking this, fine line of doing things that are, super useful, are going to move stuff, forward. But, you also have to get it done and get it published too. So it's a lot more things that go into it than what most people realize.
That's exactly right.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's always nice to chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. Big thanks to Jeff for taking time out of his very busy schedule to chat with us. Make sure to check out his website there. He's got really great stuff. Honored to have him on the podcast to discuss his brand new research, which is not only interesting, it is actionable and something that you can implement right away too. And of course, lots more questions to hopefully be answered with future research. Big thanks to Jeff. Podcast today, as always, brought to you by the Flex Diet Cert. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com, and you'll be able to get on the wait list there. We are in the process of applying for CEUs. By the time you hear this, we will have applied for CrossFit. We have applied for NSCA, NASM, and hopefully ACE also. So those are all in process. Again, I can't say if they will or will not be approved, but hopefully, fingers crossed, they will be. We still have a couple other ones in process too. So in the future, if you're listening to this, you can double check to see which CEUs are available. So go to flexdiet.com, get on the wait list there. You'll get all the latest and greatest info. And if you like this podcast, if you could do me a personal favor of putting a review or even just comments on your favorite podcast listening thinger, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or whatever, that would really help me out because I'm the one sponsoring the podcast through the Flex Diet Cert. So far to date, I haven't taken any other advertisement money or anything like that. Not that I'm against it, but I just want to have the freedom to discuss whatever I think is interesting that'll hopefully help you with body composition, performance, and do it all